Welcome, everyone, to the Wizard of Radical Self Respect. Today, I have a very special guest, Dr. Cocchiola, a coercive control expert, and she's going to talk about some stuff that I don't normally talk as much about, in particular with the kids, but that's her level of expertise and her area of expertise, and that's why she's on. But how are you today, Dr. Cocchiola?
I'm very good, Jared. Thank you so much for having me on.
It's my pleasure. And before we went live here, you were talking about how kids can sometimes take on the traits of a narcissist or an abuser. Could you explain for us what that looks like?
Yeah, I think when children grow up in a home where there is an abusive person, they learn that they have to regulate their behaviors, that they can't be themselves. They figure out subconsciously, they know they're not loved unconditionally. And authenticity is hard to come by. Being authentically yourself is not something that's comfortable in a home where there's an abuser. So think about that, right? Like children grow up in a home where, they never know how angry their father or mother are going to be at them for maybe dropping milk, or they hear the car wheels on the driveway and they're thinking, uh-oh, is dad in a good mood or is mom going to be angry with me today, right? And so that what happens to them in their bodies is they begin to recognize, I can't be myself.
Mm,
What do we know about abusers? That abusers in general really have never been able to be themselves. They've never truly accepted and loved and been accepted and loved as themselves. They've had to cover that up. And that's how, why abusers show up as charlatans, or nobody really knows that they're an abuser until they know they're an abuser, right? Because they have learned throughout their life to cover up who they really are. And that's their shame, right? They cover their shame up. And what we end up teaching children in these abusive homes is that they too have to cover themselves up, that they can't be themselves. And so I always say, like, the one thing that what we know from a clinical perspective, I'm a therapist, right? Is that the core thing that most children really require is to be loved unconditionally for who they are, no matter how they behave, no matter if they've done something wrong, and they might be punished in some way, but they are loved implicitly, and that they can always be who they truly are, that they have autonomy in life, they have agency. And abusers rob children of that. And then in that can even create the trajectory for a child to perhaps be more like an abuser.
I see. And that's where they have to earn the parents' love, right? So they feel like they have to perform. And that's also where the walking on eggshells dynamic can come into play, which is very uncomfortable. It's a very unpleasant feeling.
And it creates so much anxiety in children. What we know from research is that these kids have high anxiety, whether it's internalized maybe as depression, right? Or it's externalized in behaviors that can be aggressive or self harm. There's so many ways that these traumas are manifested, and it's all as a result of just not being able to be myself and
Mm,
loved as I am, which is just, when you think about, for me, when I think about abuse, I think there's really no greater abuse than suffering an abuse that no one would even know is happening, that it's totally unacknowledged as abuse. And it's so very much impactful on the developing ego of a human being.
right. And that's what makes them feel so alone as well. And someone said to me, I think her name, Meredith Miller, I think, said this to me. She said, if you don't feel comfortable being yourself around somebody, there's probably a very good reason for that. And that was an aha moment for me because as a kid growing up in this dynamic, I was always taught, no, you are the problem. If there's something you're feeling that's not quite right, if you're upset, you are the problem. It's not us. And just that flipping of the script to no, there's actually probably a good reason why you're not comfortable with this person. To me, that was a game changer.
It is a game changer. And to your point, a 5-year-old can't conceptualize that. And no one's telling a 5-year-old that, or an 8-year-old, or a 10 or a 12-year-old. All they know when someone says, you're the problem, is there's something wrong with them, is that I should be ashamed. I'm not loved for who I am. And by the way, I'm not valuable. I'm invaluable to the world. I don't
Right.
matter. And so that again can really reinforce a trajectory for a child to feel so much shame that they never actually are able to be themselves. And that goes back to what your first question was, then how does this manifest as a person, an adult who can be so harmful to their own children?
Right. And that's the whole thing too. Do you see a difference in between how a golden child gets treated in this way versus a scapegoat, lost child, etc.? Like, do you see many differences in that dynamic?
Well, I would say that all of them realize they can't be themselves, right? The golden child is only behaving a certain way to get maybe what they want, right? They're getting rewarded, right? The scapegoated child knows they're going to be punished or be seen as a horrible, like you're not worthy, right? And that's going to be the response, is they're going to feel like they're not valued, and the lost child knows they're not valued. So the reality is that the result, no matter, and I always say it can change, by the way, on a dime for a child. I might be the golden child today, but tomorrow that could all change. And so the child, oh my gosh, like navigating that with siblings and never knowing who's going to be the favorite, who's going to be the one that's going to be like in big trouble and be treated horribly. But also on top of that is this understanding that I'm unworthy no matter what I do. I'm not valued by this person who this is different than an intimate relationship dynamic, isn't it? Because it's an intimate relationship, but it's not my partner.
Right.
It's actually my parent. It's my caretaker, someone I rely on for life itself, that I can't rely on. That I mean, the devastating consequences. And, I think this is a pretty, unfortunately, a very prevalent problem where even parents who aren't meaning to diminish their child's autonomy, if they're parenting in an old school way where they're authoritarian and they're punishing all the time children for behaviors instead of actually trying to, we call it, you can correct or you can coach.
Hmm.
And if you're constantly correcting, you're igniting shame in a child over and over and over again, versus if you're coaching, you're supporting a child to shift towards growth. Yeah.
And I think a lot of their favorite sayings would be, "It's good to be the king. It's good to be the queen. It's got to be do as I say, not as I do." All of those blanket, basically, do what you're told. Doesn't matter what I do. Just do as you're told and be controllable. That's the other part, right? They want you to be controllable.
Well, you just hit the nail on the head, right? Because what do we know about narcissistic abusers? Is that the only way that they feel good is if they have the ability to exert power and control over people. And so it's coercive control is what it is. And that's why I call these abusers, I call them narcissistic abusers, but I also call them coercive controllers, because they are, what is the behavior they're doing? Narcissistic abuse isn't necessarily a behavior. Coercive control is a behavior.
Mm,
It is about diminishing a person's autonomy, retaining control over someone, using their vulnerabilities against them. Take a child. How vulnerable is a child, right? They're dependent on you for food, for shelter, for, we would hope, love and affection and
right.
attention, right? And so, this idea that, understanding that, for me, all abuse, the underpinning of all abuse, racism, sexism, you name it, is coercion and control. Anybody who punches you is punching you because they're trying to control a situation. Now, are they an abuser? Maybe not. Maybe they just have they have poor coping mechanisms and they can get help. But most people who have a pattern of needing to exert power and control over another person or a group of people, most people cannot heal. They actually have these traits that make them have a desire as a result of their own shame, their own vulnerabilities, being their own harm. But again, there's no excuse for abuse, right? So that they need to exert power and control over others. They are always trying to level up, like and override the playing field. They're always trying to create inequality and dynamics that helps them feel powerful.
Right.
So that parent you were just describing, right, who does that to the child, why is he doing that or she doing that? Because they feel more powerful when they do that. They don't they aren't trying to help. They feel more powerful. Someone who's a racist feels like they have more power. Someone who abuses a child or traffics a child or like any or verbally abuses someone, that's about power and control, right?
Absolutely. When I was talking to Dr. George Simon the other day, that's what he really emphasized. He said, position, position, position. If they're here, they want you to be here. Now, if it's the other way around, they're going to be really upset about that. And they're going to try to do anything they can to get you in that one down position, right? But
Yeah, retaliation, right? And revenge. And so we have a recent research study that came out that talks about the dark tetrad, right? It's narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, the willingness to perhaps break the law or do something very close to breaking the law, but sadism. And so these are people, the people that I work with in particular, the victims I work with in particular, are dealing with people who will do anything to regain control if they've lost it. So, like the moment a victim leaves an abusive relationship, I'm going to do whatever I can to wield power and control over you, including weaponize the children, including harm the children in some way, neglect them, be too permissive, or just make them turn against you, like totally rob you of your motherhood or fatherhood. I'm going to do whatever I can because I want to hurt you so badly. I like to hurt you. Like that's like the sadistic part of it,
right.
right?
And they do really enjoy that. And people who don't understand it, they just wouldn't believe. They wouldn't believe how low they'll go and how ridiculous and childish they'll be. But there really is no limit to it.
Yeah, no, what you said is so important because I think I have a podcast called Perfect Prey because I believe that there are some people in this world who could not ever imagine that someone could be so harmful,
Right. And
right?
that's
And
why it's so important you are doing what you're doing because people don't know. People don't they wouldn't believe it if they heard it. Like, oh no, that doesn't happen. It doesn't get that bad. They'll try to
absolutely.
minimize it.
Absolutely. I've been doing this work since I was 19. I've been educating on this topic since I was 19. I am a college professor who teaches on domestic abuse, coercive control, every single semester, child abuse, you name it. I'm a therapist, and I was married to someone for 27 years and 11 months who was an abuser. Never physically violent. Coercive control can certainly be physically violent. It's the underpinning of all abuse. But because I didn't suffer physical violence, I couldn't figure out what there was gaslighting and manipulation and all of that, but I couldn't figure it out. And so even the most astute of us can miss the signs because it's not always so blatant, right? I mean, it could be very insidious. It's very nuanced. And with children, they totally miss the signs. They wouldn't, how would they
Right.
know what gaslighting is or what any of this is?
Exactly. Now, and this is the initial trauma bond for the kids too. Like they're trying to attach to their caregivers because every kid will try at the very least to attach. But when it's a character disordered person like this, it's not going to be a healthy attachment. And then they're 1,000 times more likely, it seems like, to get into a romantic relationship with someone in adulthood if that was their upbringing. So, what do you do to try to get people to unravel that, to untangle that?
The trauma, yeah. So I think one of the things that I particularly work with the parents I work with is that, we always learned like in divorce situations, you never put a child in the middle. And that's actually not correct. We don't put them in the middle. We actually have to prioritize them getting clarity. And what that means is that we don't ever have to say anything bad about the other parent, but we do have to call out behaviors. We spend a lifetime in relationships, or months, weeks, months, years, or whatever it is, in relationships where we gaslight ourselves into thinking they're okay, right? That they're not unhealthy. And we do this to our children, where we kind of act sometimes as if everything's fine. We don't want them to see the argument. We create, and I actually don't call it gaslighting, because gaslighting has malice intent, like a malicious intent. I call it intuition disintegration.
Oh, interesting. I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah, yeah. So it's this idea that we disintegrate our children's intuition when we minimize bad experiences that they're having. When we say, oh, or that our child doesn't want to go sit on Uncle John's lap. And we say, oh, go sit on Uncle John's lap. He loves you. He loves you so much. What have we just done to our child? We've disintegrated their intuition. We've made them not listen to their body. Their body is telling them something doesn't feel right. And we're forcing them to do something that doesn't feel right. And we do the same thing in a family system when there's abusers. We kind of like pretend they're not as bad. Or when you have an alcoholic in the family, you're like, oh, well, no, dad didn't drink too much tonight, or mom didn't drink too much tonight. We minimize it so that they don't feel pain. But the problem is that then they don't have any intuition to tell them when something isn't right.
That's a
And that
huge one.
and that fortifies the trauma bond, doesn't it? When you literally have no ability, you disassociate from the bad, you become trauma bonded, and your intuition, you totally ignore. You disintegrate, you literally disintegrate from your intuition.
I
And
love
so,
that.
yeah, I find it extremely helpful for protective parents to understand that now what I want you to do is, you don't have to say anything bad about, dad or mom, but what you can do is say, there was a lot of yelling yesterday, and that really is inappropriate when someone calls someone else a bad name. Bad name calling is not appropriate. Now, I didn't say your dad is a horrible person for calling me bad names. I didn't say anything disparaging about the person. I called out the behavior. And that is what helps give children clarity. How do we expect a child at 5, 8, 10, and 12 witnessing abuse going on? It's more than witnessing. What we know from the research is they're truly experiencing in their body. They are having those exact experiences. Yet when we divorce or separate from that person, we expect them to understand that that person may not be safe. But we've hidden all along. We've tried to disintegrate. We've disintegrated their intuition. We haven't allowed them to feel it in the home.
Right.
That's a problem.
Right.
It's
And
sad. It's sad. I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not saying, like, who wants their kid to feel pain? I didn't want my kids to feel pain, but we have to actually help them to see what behaviors are healthy and what behaviors are unhealthy.
And I think what you said is exactly what happens. They lose touch with what they're really thinking and feeling. They lose touch with their authentic selves because they were either suppressing it, or they outright lose touch with it completely, because what will happen is they'll speak up, but then they'll be shut down. They'll speak up and then they'll be criticized, guilted, etc. And they'll learn, oh, this is what happens if I speak up. This is what happens if I keep it real about what I'm thinking and feeling. I get punished.
Absolutely. So better to be quiet, better to disassociate, better to try to get along with everybody, even if they're a harmful person. And then what happens is, right, then they go into adulthood and they end up in relationships with people who are abusive, or maybe as a result of that experience in their childhood, now they try to control others more. They are exerting power and control over people because they felt so out of control in their childhood. They
Right.
had they felt like so lost, right? Yeah. No,
Absolutely.
mm.
And so, what would you say to someone on the outside looking in? What are some of the behaviors to look for in kids if they're growing up in this kind of dynamic?
So one of the things we know is that oftentimes ADD and ADHD is actually a manifestation of trauma.
Mm,
And so if you take, a classroom of about 30 kids, you're going to have, 5 kids in that classroom who are suffering some form of abuse in their home, right? Actually, the stats are very high for child sexual abuse out of a class of 30, but certainly all of that, all of the abuses are coercion and control. It's grooming someone, pulling someone in, luring them into a relationship, making someone believe they have to rely on you. And this is what abusers do in family systems, right?
sure.
So a child who's not really able to focus, a child who's hyper focused on something, a child who has lots of anxiety, panic attacks, dysregulation, they're constantly having challenges in relationship dynamics, having challenges with friends, maybe, um, certainly self harm. These are some of the manifestations, right?
Sure.
And depression. So, depression, anger is depression turned outward. That's all it is. It's like my fear, my sadness is all going to just come out, and I'm going to be angry, right? And then when children are feeling that fear, they pull it in, they may demonstrate more depression, right?
Right.
And so those are things to look for. The issue becomes, how does a child actually share what's going on when they can't actually name it, right?
Right. It's so difficult because they don't know, and even adults don't know a lot of times. So, if someone's seeing this from the outside, do you recommend they do anything, say anything? Is there a proper way to go about it?
Well, one of the things I think that these children need, that's vital, is they need their safe parent to really be working on attachment, connecting to the child, really, really fortifying a connection and attachment to the child. Because when you're living in a space of dysregulation, you never know if you're safe. Attachment is really, really hard to fortify.
Right.
So for me, anybody who's listening, who they are living in this experience, and there's no judgment for people who stay, because sometimes it's really hard to escape it, right? Um, but if you're living in it, know that the one thing you can do is fortify your child's attachment with you, like work on that, like intentionally, like understand that abusers are constantly trying to make the child feel dysregulated, unable to attach, inability to be authentic. And so you've got to work. I say protective parents work double time, like on that. They have to work like so hard on that. Um, so I would also say that if you're an outsider and you know there's something's going on, and here's the thing, if there's no physical violence, can you really get child welfare involved? I mean, what are they going to do? Right? Like these are the nuanced abuses that are not recognized in any of our systems. They're not recognized as abuse in our schools when the children come and maybe report that they're afraid to go home, because not because dad will or mom will hit them, but because they're just afraid to go home, right? And so they can't name it. The child can't name it. The school can't name it. This is not abuse the pediatricians will be referring. This is not abuse the child welfare will investigate. This is not abuse family court acknowledges at all. And so what that child needs more than anything is a connection.
Oh,
So if you
absolutely.
so if you see this and you know this child, if you're a grandparent, can you like spend extra time? If you're an uncle, if you're the coach on the team, and you just make a little extra, you just give that child just a little extra attention, just connect, because that will help them to regulate more. Yeah, sorry, my Kit Kat crying.
Oh, that's cute. But,
Yeah,
I think that's the thing, making sure the honest lines of communication are still there. Because as long as they're still there, there's a shot. Like, okay, maybe they're gonna be honest with you about what's going on, and then you'll be able to help them more. But when they shut down and they don't talk, and then you don't know what's going on, then it gets really tricky.
I think you're right. Yeah, I also think like no child wants to like, a child doesn't want to be pulled away from their parent. They
Right.
they love their parent, even if their parent doesn't love them. And that would be something important to highlight, I think, is a lot of people think that just because someone's your parent, they love you. And that's not true. Abusers do not know how to actually love, like in a way that is healthy. They love, as you started off the call with, they love with conditions,
Right.
right? And children know that. So I think helping parents who are safe and protective understand that disengaging from that person, if you can, is okay because they're not healthy. And in teaching our children that they don't have to stay around people who are unhealthy, that as young adults, they can make choices to be around people who are good for them versus harmful for them. But if we don't start that conversation very young, then it's going to be more challenging.
Absolutely. And what are your suggestions for a protective parent when the abusive parent is weaponizing the children against them, trying to punish them or trying to triangulate the kids with the protective parent? What
Yeah.
are your suggestions for a situation like that?
Yeah, I mean, these are such challenging situations because, man, I mean, so in my situation, my children recall the day that my ex started indoctrinating them. I had caught him having an affair, and I left with the kids like for the weekend to my parents, and then came back because supposedly we were going to get therapy and get better or whatever. And when I
Hmm.
left to go to work that night, is when he started telling them I had cheated, that I hadn't been taking my medication, that I was unstable and I could not be trusted. They were 9 and 10. I didn't separate from him until they were 17 and 19, and it wasn't until my daughter was 17 that she told me he did that for all those years. So what I would say to anybody listening, if you're with an abuser, know that they've been doing this since day one. They've just maybe been hiding it, but
Hmm.
they have been weaponizing your child in some way against you, slowly eroding away the connection you have with your child. Because if they can do that, they have a better ability to exert power and control over you and over the child. You take away someone's agency, their autonomy in a relationship, they're much easier to control. And, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I always want people to know that abusers start day one. And the one thing you can do is know in your head that this is happening. And if you're staying, work on fortifying that attachment. That means that we correct less, we connect more. That means intentionally, as I was saying before, making the time to sit with your child, take them out for a hike, go out for hot cocoa, creating as much connection as you can around things that do not ignite fear in them. So if you're going to reprimand them for bad behavior, that's probably not going to, that doesn't mean you don't address bad behavior. It just means that we're connecting much more, because these kids, that will help them actually behave. People don't realize that. They think they have to correct their children in order to get them to follow the rules. And the reality is the more your child feels connected to you, the more they will follow whatever the rules are.
Is that's the wisdom part of it, right? Because sometimes people will try to control or be pushy about it, even from a good place, right? Not just narcissists will do that. Even sometimes good parents can do that too. But I think there's wisdom lacking in it because, like you just said, when you're on their team, they're going to want to be, okay, I'm going to listen to what they say, as opposed to the parent that's instantly, no, do it this way, do it that way, and punishing, correcting. I don't like that very much. I don't, and nobody does for the most part, right? Nobody likes that.
Nobody does. And then weaponized children tend to be so dysregulated that their behaviors are worse. They're going to behave in a way that does trigger. They're going to push buttons more. That's what they're going to do because they can't regulate themselves. So if we think about the brain, and the lower part of the brain, the bottom part of the brain is the reptilian part of the brain. It's like the survival part of the brain. Children living in abusive homes are living in survival all of the time.
Right.
They are hardly ever getting opportunities to just relax. And so what we know is that what can help someone get out of that reptilian part of the brain is the center part of the brain, the limbic section, where you can actually connect with someone. And then the top part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the part that does the real thinking and figuring out things, then can work. But it doesn't work as well if I don't feel connected. And I cannot connect with anybody if I'm constantly in survival mode. So you see, if we can support them getting out of survival mode, connecting, then maybe they'll get to cognitive processing and follow the rules. Or let's just take it a step further. You have a weaponized child. They've been indoctrinated against you. They hate your guts, right? Well, they're living in reptilian part of the brain. They are constantly living in survival. They've been told you're crazy, something's wrong with you. They also know the abuser, if they don't follow what the abuser says, they're going to be punished. They've seen what happens. They know what happens in this family system when people don't do what the abuser wants. So they're living in reptilian part of the brain. What can we do? Well, they called us a horrible name. We can reprimand them, or we can just try to connect. Like it's called co-regulation. We could like maybe let them call us a name and say, gosh, I don't think that's true. And just like flip it, be flippant about it, right? Like, or really? I think I know where you maybe heard that, but I don't think it's true. And kind of be a little snarky about it. Be a little lighter about it, which is really hard when when they actually are mimicking the abuser's behavior, by the way. Oh my gosh, so hard. I say we're actresses on stage or actors on stage. We're performers. We're performing as if it doesn't bother us, even though we want to go in the bathroom and cry, right? But if we can connect, then they can cognitively process and we can have a conversation an hour or two from now and say, I promise you, I didn't cheat. I'm not the cheater, honey. We can have that, but we can't have it in the moment that they're having their
Right.
little fit. It's not going to work. They're in survival mode, the
Right.
lower part of the brain. Yeah.
That's where it's important to take that step back. And there's a term you reminded me of. It's called amuse mastery, where you're able to kind of have a lighthearted attitude about some of that. And of course, it's very difficult in the moment with that kind of thing. It's always going to be the most difficult in the moment. And circling back to what you said in the beginning, I know I have heard this. You can let me know if it's true, that people who have had a narcissistic or abusive parent way more likely to develop an anxiety disorder and most certainly CPTSD. You said ADHD as well. Is there anything else that you see them have? Maybe other attachment issues, perhaps?
Yeah. So, first of all, what we know is that the secure attachment to it that is vital for child development, right, can be fractured. I call it malicious fracturing of attachment, where abusers purposefully, maliciously fracture that attachment with the protective, the safe parent, with grandparents, with extended family, right? It's anything to isolate and I call it the three I's. Abusers like to isolate, they like to intimidate in order to indoctrinate. That's how they do
Mm,
it. It's what happens in cults. It's kind of the same idea. It's a cult in the family, but it's the same idea. So they, cult leaders, what do? They isolate people, they intimidate people, right? They say, oh, if you don't do this, then this won't happen. You won't actually have whatever it is we're willing to give you, right? And so in that, you're more readily able to be indoctrinated. And so, yeah, these children suffer all of these things. They don't necessarily suffer ADHD as a result of this, but what we know is that this can manifest like ADHD.
okay.
So, like a low affect, like not paying attention, or maybe being hyper focused on something, or dysregulated in school. A lot of these kids who have trauma are getting diagnosed with ADD or ADHD when actually it may not be that, it might be trauma, right?
Mm,
And how amazing would it be if our schools, which we already have so much, teachers have so much pressure already to do so much, but wouldn't it be really amazing if we were able to assess for all kinds of trauma, even the trauma that we can't see? Like,
sure.
do we know that, Jared's living in a home where he doesn't feel safe and able to regulate his behavior, like to be authentically himself? Do we know that? No, we don't know that, you know? And so how would we find that out? I mean, that'd be really hard, but that would be ideal
And I think
because
that's important to mention too, like you said, that sometimes the behaviors of someone with CPTSD, they can mimic that of ADHD. And it might not really be ADHD, but the behaviors are very similar. And it's a symptom of the CPTSD or PTSD that they have.
right, that's right. Absolutely. So their complex post-traumatic stress is because the trauma never ends. It's always going on. Like, I mean, we came up with the word PTSD because we had major events in war. That's how it came up, right? It
Right.
was called battle fatigue and other names. And so the reality is it was like considered, oh, he saw one incident or he had one horrifying experience in war, which is again horrifying for sure. But the idea behind it being complex is it doesn't really end, and that it's going on all of the time. And there's no ability to heal from the trauma when you're constantly living in the trauma, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure if you're as familiar with this part too, but when someone has an abusive parent or narcissistic parent, are they more likely to become anxiously attached or become more of an avoidant or become a dismissive avoidant or disorganized, or does it really all depend?
I think it really all depends. I think so. There's some really, this is really important conversation. I have a protective parenting program. It's based on attachment
Oh,
because,
good, good. So you know
yeah,
this. Good.
it's attachment based. So the idea is that the abuser is always trying to fracture that attachment with loved ones and whatever is important and healthy for the child's development. And so, especially when a victim attempts to escape, because now the abuser is going to like tighten their grip. They're going to like further want to wield control, and they're going to use the children in that process. And so ideally, children have secure attachment. Abusers have disorganized attachment. That's the kind of attachment that they have in their life. They're not able to have strong relationship attachments to other people. They are confused, living in fear, uncertain, right? A lot of uncertainty. And that disorganized attachment is what they are actually imposing onto their children. So, is there a variation? Might they have anxious or avoidant somewhere in there? Sure. There are variations, and I see it with all of my clients. They'll have a child who maybe is able to securely attach to the protective parent, fantastic. Or a child who's got avoidant, or a child who is on the trajectory to be more like an abuser, which is disorganized.
I see. And to reiterate, connection, that's the best way to try to steer them off of that path. Connection and just having those open lines of communication open.
Yeah, like reigniting attachment at all costs is like vital for them to become healthy at almost all costs, right? And so, I mean, it's not totally black and white, but I mean, again, you cannot really cognitively process what's happening to you unless you're connected to someone. And so, how do we fortify connection? And that is creating safe environments where we co-regulate, where if something's disruptive, I am not reactive to you, I am calm in my response to you, because that creates safety for you. If you've lived in a dysregulated, unsafe place, you haven't been able to be yourself, you haven't felt loved for who you are, I create that as much as possible. I'll give you a little example, it might be a little helpful. So, like, your child comes home and they call you a horrible name, and you say, "You're just like your father. You
Mm,
you called me names just like him. You're going to be just like him." Does that make the child feel safe? Absolutely not, right? And that actually reinforces for the child that they are bad, that they are devalued, that they can't securely attach to you, that they are going to run down the rope there of being more disorganized in their attachments. Versus they come home, they call you a horrible name, and you're like, that's not true, sweetheart. But okay. All right. If you think so, but I don't agree. Right. And you become a little bit more of this mild mannered responsiveness. And all of a sudden, the abuser is sending them back to your house to coercively control you, to diminish you, to have agency, to rob you of your agency. And if you allow them by reacting, you are actually reinforcing what the abuser wants.
Mm.
If you don't, eventually it starts to dissipate. Eventually. And then in that, your child can now attach to you. So it's really about us being very looking through, as I say, the coercive control lens, understanding that these children have suffered really significant abuse that nobody acknowledges, and that we have to, if they were coming home from another parent's house and they had a broken leg, how would you treat them? You treat them differently,
Right.
wouldn't you? You'd be more gentle. You'd be more accommodating. They have broken brain. Their
Mm.
brains have literally been broken and traumatized by an abuser. Do you want to keep the brain broken, or do you want to help the brain to heal? It heals with connection, and connection has to feel safe.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so sneaky and insidious, because you don't see it as obviously as you would a broken
Yeah.
bone. I mean, it reminds me of what Anthony Kiedis said in that song from Red Hot Chili Peppers. I got a bad disease, but when from my brain is where I bleed, kind of thing. It's like
Mhm,
that.
mhm.
So the other thing I wanted to circle back from you was you had mentioned you were in a relationship for many years and you're a therapist and you didn't see it. And I think that's important to go over too, that what made it so difficult for you to see given what you do.
So living in a gaslit world, right? Thinking that I need to work harder. I need to keep trying to fix this. There must be something wrong with me. And also, of course, wanting to keep my family together, right? And wanting to believe that the other person actually had redeeming qualities.
Mm,
I mean, there's like this belief, a lot of us, what we know about victims and survivors is they tend to be highly agreeable, loyal to a fault, forgiving. The glass is half full, highly optimistic. They
sure.
see things from a positive light, and so I would say is why I kept working hard. I left several times, but I always went back, and it was
Mm,
because so the abusers, they'll do this thing where they will tell you, you're awful, and that you're a loser, and that everybody's going to know who you really are. They're going to tell everybody what a horrible mother and human being you are, and then send you messages that say that you're their soulmate. It's the
mm.
intermittent reinforcement too. So to your point, I was very trauma bonded. I was
Right.
very trauma bonded. Yeah.
And people in the victim position there, a lot of times they do project their good qualities onto the other person. And I think, oh, I would do this if I was in their position. But when it comes to people like that, it just doesn't work that way. And if anything, it gets used against them. And then they get taken advantage of and exploited even more. And like you said, it takes on average 7 times to leave an abusive relationship.
I mean, there's a woman who did that research quite some time ago. And I reached out to her recently to just say, are you going to be updating this research or anything like that? But yeah, no, it definitely does. And everybody I talk to, they've tried to leave several times, and abusers will lure them back in, right? With the good, right? Or the threats of how bad it could be. You're going to lose
Right,
your
that too.
children. You're going to lose your house. You're going to, all of these things. And now back to like where we started is like, imagine a little child. They don't want to lose that relationship with that person, even if they've been horrible. Right. And then if we as the other parent have diminished their intuition, we've kind of made it seem like it's not that bad, or I always say, like, protective parents will be like, oh, your father's a little late today, he must have had to work late, that's why he was late, and they make excuses, right?
Mm,
Like, why not just be honest and say, you know what, sweetheart, I'm really sorry that dad's late again. It's happened before. That's gotta hurt. That's that's
yeah.
the truth. That's the truth. Why do we have to keep covering for someone who has a pattern of coming late all the time? Which frankly, if abusers come late, I'm happy. I'm like, don't come at all. I'm very happy.
I mean, and you reminded me of the term deering, defend, excuse, explain, rationalize. A
Oh
lot
yeah.
of victims, they do find themselves doing that. And I always say to people, if you catch yourself doing that, you got to be really mindful. Why am I doing this? Is it a pattern? Is it a specific situation? But whatever it is, it's just important to notice it.
Absolutely notice it. Yes, absolutely notice it. And know that, when you're trying to be, when you're with your children, you don't want to disparage the other parent, and you don't want to put that person down. As they get older, they might ask questions, and you might be ready to tell them that relationship was very unhealthy. We had a toxic relationship. You don't have to say he was toxic, right? Because now what you're doing is you're doing exactly what the abuser does about you. So you see, we have to actually show up differently than the abuser, right? If the abuser says you yell all the time, well, then you're probably not going to yell too much anymore, right? Like at all, because your child will be hypersensitive to any yelling. Even if you don't yell at all, they'll be hypersensitive to it. And so people say to me, you're telling me to act like I walk on eggshells with my child. I'm like, no, I'm telling you, actually, you walked on eggshells for safety with the abuser. I'm telling you to perform differently with your child so that your child sees you through a different lens. That's what I'm
Mm,
telling you.
I love that. And that reminds me, what is perspecticide?
Yeah, so perspecticide is a term that Dr. Evan Stark came up with. He's the propeller of the term coercive control. And he said that what would happen is that abusers can change or shift your perspective on what's happened very quickly. And he called it perspecticide because all of a sudden your perspective totally changed on what happened. Like you may have thought, wait a minute, that just, it's kind of like gaslighting, right? It's kind of the same idea. Your perspective changes. He calls it an unknowing what we should know. Like if,
Mm.
if our intuition was working correctly, and abusers are constantly, again, diminishing that, they're gaslighting us, so we lose our intuition. If the intuition was working correctly, we wouldn't lose our perspective.
So you've taught me a few things new here. I didn't know about that term, suspecticide. I didn't know about the three eyes. And what are the three eyes again?
So abusers will isolate and intimidate in order to indoctrinate.
I love that. And then your word for gaslighting is?
So gaslighting occurs with adults, but when protective parents are doing it with their children, when they pretend that things aren't as bad as they are disintegrating intuition.
Ah, okay. So those are three good ones to remember there. I love that.
Thank
And
you.
also, what would you want to replace reactive abuse with?
Oh, there's no such thing as reactive abuse. No such thing. Because that actually insinuates that the person reacting is abusive. And really, what we know is that oftentimes when people are trapped over and over again, eventually you're gonna react. You're gonna have a reaction. It's self-defense at that point. You're defending yourself. You are engaged in self-defense if you've been called horrible names for the last days, weeks, months, or years, and finally one day you're like, and you call that person a bad name. Was that reactive abuse, or was that you just finally defending yourself?
Right. And they blow that up out of proportion. Like they can do 1,000 things and then you do that one thing and they act like you're the crazy one that needs mental help, that needs therapy, that needs to be on meds, fill in the blank.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's why I also like when I think about statistics related to domestic abuse, think about how often, like, maybe a victim decides to finally push back. Now the police get called. This is after years and years and years of being abused, coerced and controlled, right? And now decides to push back. And now the police get called. And who's the victim on the stats? The, the perpetrator.
Yeah. And I've heard that happen a lot too, where they do that in that very scenario. They're quick to do it because they know that's their plan.
Yeah,
Oh,
no,
they did one thing. I'm going to call the police. The police maybe haven't been called before. So this other person's going to look like the bad guy.
yeah. So I'll give you two more terms: provoke and record. abusers love to provoke and record, right? And my colleague Lisa Fontes came up with that. And also DARVO, right? They deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender is what they do all the time. And so the police come, well, she pushed him that day, that moment, because she was like so frustrated. Finally, she just pushed back, and
Right.
now he's the victim. Yeah. Or the
It's
vice
ex-
versa.
and
Hmm.
extremely frustrating. And you also have, I guess, new ideas about domestic violence versus coercive control. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't like using the word domestic violence because it makes it continues to reaffirm that in order for abuse to be occurring, it has to be physically violent.
Okay.
And the reality is that abuse often, more often than not, the underpinning of abuse is about coercion and control. And what abusers use is psychological tactics like gaslighting, manipulation, intimidation, and isolation, and certainly financial abuse and sexual abuse and legal abuse. And if I can no longer control you and using all of those, I'm going to go to physical violence. That's what I'm going to do because I can no longer control you with this. This is why we know femicides and filicides happen when women leave abusive relationships. They have a greater risk of death. And it's because he can no longer control in that environment, right? And the weaponization of children is certainly part of that need to exert power and
Right.
control.
And that is going to be the situation where an abusive person is the most dangerous at a time when the person has just gotten out or that abusive person has lost control. That's when they're going to be the most dangerous.
Absolutely, absolutely. They did a research study. It's quite dated at this point, but about 231 victims, female victims, had left their abusers, and a fifth were murdered within 2 days, I think, or 5 days of the restraining order. So, because it's about power and control, that's why.
Right.
Mhm.
And what are the ways that you say for people to stay safe, to help them to either call this out when they see it or simply to stay safe?
Well, I think one of the things we know is that if a victim is attempting to escape a relationship, they probably don't tell the abuser until they're gone. Like you have to actually escape and be safe. So, getting to a safe space is really important. That oftentimes does mean leaving your home and leaving your belongings, many of your belongings behind. Yeah, and getting as much support as possible, pulling in all of your family, friends, loved ones, because you're going to need an army of people to support you through the process.
Yeah, and that is the hard part because all the variables, right? There's financial variables, living together variables. It's not as easy as just breaking up and leaving for a lot of people.
Right. No, this is why, I like Dr. Evan Stark's quote. He says, coercive control is like carpenter ants devouring the foundation of a house. You don't even know it's happening until it's
Mm,
too late. But what we do is we always ask, why didn't she leave? Instead of saying, why did that other person abuse? Or like we ask victims all the time, why did you stay? It's like, well, wait a minute. Like I didn't even know it was happening. Would we say that to someone whose house collapsed because of carpenter ants? We'd never say it. Yet we say it to victims all of the time. It's hard to
right.
leave.
And
Nobody's
that's
judging anyone for staying.
and that's why we have a mutual friend, Grace Stewart, who has a podcast called Why She Stayed.
Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, amazing, amazing.
Yeah, and I seen you were a guest on there too.
I was.
That was
Yes, I
awesome. It's
was.
awesome to see.
Yep.
But where else can people find you, Dr. Cocchiola?
Yeah, so they can find me on Coercive Control Consulting. That's my website, and I provide clinical work, meaning therapy for people, support for people who are trying to escape or trying to figure out how to navigate the family court system or trying to parent their children. And I also have a protective parenting program that is all attachment based to support protective parents on the best way to support their children who are suffering this abuse.
I
Yeah.
love that. I love that. Thank you so much for coming on here. Any other closing thoughts you have for us?
No, but we do need better therapists, and I do train therapists on this too, and attorneys. So we need people to really understand when people come into their office what this is, when children come into their office, what they're experiencing. So thank you so much for having me on, Jared.
It was absolutely a pleasure. I learned a lot today. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one, everyone. Thank